Thanks for joining me. If you're listening, you're tuned into TAT, otherwise known as the Alphabet Podcast, with me, your host, Leanna Devine. Now, if you've been tuning in for a couple of weeks, you'll be well aware of the concept by now and be aware that we're up to C on Alphabet. And for those of you who haven't managed to tune in yet, please go back and listen to the segments on attachment and boundaries. Hopefully you'll find something of interest to yourself there. But now we're up to C. So it's an alphabet concept where we take an A to Z of issues that may be affecting people both inside and outside of the therapy room. So today, the topic that I've chosen to look at a bit closer is complicated grief. Now, I know for most people that conversations around grief are not particularly comfortable, and I totally empathize and I understand why that would be the case. Were you estranged from them? Were you on bad terms? Were there family conflicts that's making this natural process of grief more difficult? So maybe financial ramblings or who gets what? Because that happens in a lot of families. I've seen it happen. Believe me, it's heartbreaking, but it does happen. For me as a therapist, I think a big one is your previous deaths and other losses that you've had, especially if it's come at an early age. It can be more impactful. What's your relationship with loss? The more loss that you've had, I would suggest that it's more likely that you would suffer from complicated grief, because it would just be like one thing on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. Certain mental health conditions make it more likely that you would suffer from complicated grief. So if you have maybe an emotionally unstable personality disorder, or BPD as it's often called, depression and anxiety, complicated grief is more likely to happen there, where you already got these complex feelings and now you have something else to deal with. But a big one, and a real big one, is the loss of a child. Now, for most people that never lost a child is probably something that is unimaginable. But for some people, that is something that they've experienced. There are parents out there that's lost more than one child. And it's like, how do you deal with complicated grief? How do you get to that stage? Remember, we talk about the stages of grief. I can understand how you would be in the denial and have the anger and the bargaining and the depression. But how do you get to that acceptance that then enables you to accept this new normal and move on? Now, I have a very special guest on the podcast today. It's my first guest of the series, and it's a very, very, very special guest, an important guest to me. Now, Rachel Webb in 2017 tragically lost her son. Her son, Kyron, was murdered. And some of you may have heard it on the news and even know Rachel in person, because she's an important figure. A lot of people in South London in particular know Rachel. Me personally, for a period of time, I went to the same school as Rachel, secondary school. So we have a long history, and she's someone who I consider to be a dear friend. But even as someone that is close to Rachel, I cannot even begin to imagine what she has gone through. And as a result of, as you can imagine, she experienced complicated grief, and to a certain extent is still going through that grief. But Rachel found a very therapeutic and healthy outlet for that grief, and she started to write a diary she kept as a record of her grief and her feelings and how she felt, as a way of kind of coping. Because for a lot of people, writing about their feelings can be quite therapeutic. So Rachel started writing these diaries, and eventually this became a book which is public. And it's a very powerful book. So, but with little further ado, I'm going to bring Rachel in now, because Rachel is the best person to tell her story. I cannot tell her story or the story of her beloved son like Rachel. We're going to welcome Rachel to the podcast, and I'm so, so grateful that she's given her time to share her experiences. And hopefully you, the listeners, even though you may find some of what Rachel's saying quite difficult and, you know, probably going to get quite emotional, as you can hear, even thinking about what Rachel was about to share is making me feel quite emotional. And I think that's quite normal. But because it makes you feel emotional and it's difficult, it's not a good enough reason not to listen. So I want you guys to listen and not just see it or hear it as a story of tragedy, but maybe also as a story of hope. And hopefully you will find it helpful. Oh, hey, Rach, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have you here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, don't be shy. This is me and you. Yeah, I mean, don't think that anyone else can hear us. It's just you and I. So thank you for coming and agreeing to do this.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so it's an important topic, complicated grief. And I think before we get on to some questions that some of the listeners have put for me to ask you, it's for you to tell the listeners a bit more about your book. Because it's a very beautifully written, very powerful, sad in a lot of places, but I found a lot of hope from reading it.
So the book itself is called Kyron, and the title is Hello Madness, Goodbye Joy. And it's basically a diary of my journey. I would say through a journey of grief to a degree, but it's a story about my 15-year-old son who was stabbed on the 17th of October 2017 following a discussion with a group of boys who had put out a song, and Kyron had said the song was rubbish. And because of that, he had really, hurt the ego of the two particular boys of the group. And during the conversation in October, Kyron was subsequently stabbed twice, one in the heart and again which caused him to die from his injuries 3 days later in hospital. During that time, I noticed that I didn't really understand the emotion that I was going through or what I was experiencing. I didn't have anybody around me who had lost a child through this sort of level of violence before. And in writing the book, I kind of wanted to become the very person I knew I needed, the start. So in the book, I tried to answer questions that I was asking myself and kind of give myself the understanding. For example, there's a question that you always ask when something happens, and that's always why. And I think through the book, I wanted the readers to understand that there isn't actually any comfort in why. Like, there's no reason or rationale that you're ever going to be given as to why you've had to face something so ugly that will ever be justifiable to the pain or the experiences that you then have to experience because of that traumatic event. So it was things like, and it was just ways to show people that there's so many different ways that you can communicate when you're going through these things. Sometimes it might be via writing. It could be through poetry, which you can see in the book. I do put bits of poetry in. Sometimes it's just a thought process that doesn't even make sense. But in doing so, it was quite a cathartic process for me because it helped me to kind of navigate myself through something that even time I still myself didn't really understand.
That's just really powerful. And for those of you that are interested in reading the book, I suggest that you do. I mean, it was in parts difficult to read because it's so raw. I think you admit it's very raw.
Yeah.
It's all your raw emotions, but I also found it very difficult to put down. And
it's one of those things, isn't it? People always say, oh, I can't even imagine what you're going through. But I think the difference is when you read the book, because I'm taking you through it with me as I'm experiencing it, as I'm feeling it, because it was my diary. You don't have to imagine what I'm going through because you can see exactly in black and white what it is I'm going through. And because you're reading it with your mind's eye, naturally your own inner emotions kind of get a bit tangled into that because you're having to absorb the pain and the anguish of me in my own words. And if anybody understands slightly aspect of what the person's going through, then I think you feel it.
Yeah. And I think that's what it was. I felt parts that I had to put it down. That's how I felt. But you kind of mentioned in your book, like, you said, I think there was a line where you said you apologize if it comes across quite repetitive. But, for those of you that find it difficult to read and difficult process, you can put the book down.
Yeah.
But for me, there is no putting this down. And
there's not a pause button. There's not a stop button. Like, you can put it down, fold your page, come back to it in 6 weeks time. But in reality, for me, there's no pause. There's no stop. This is my life. This is my living day to day nightmare. You go to sleep and wake up in that same nightmare, and it goes on and on and on. It's like that Groundhog Day. It's that ever turning cycle. It's just going on and on and on and on and on, and nothing you can do can ever make it stop.
And I think just as a standalone, that would be enough to be dealing with for one person. But, for you, life had to continue almost instantly for your surviving children.
Yeah. And that's it. And I think it was one of those one where it was a sandwich trauma. So 5 days before Kyron was murdered, I actually had just lost my job, and I've been working for the organisation for 6 years, and was actually based, somebody had said that, like, raised malicious allegations. It was it was unfounded in the end, but I'd lost my job because of it and only had it turned over through an appeals process. But that was 5 days before. Then Kyron was murdered. And then on the flip side, my other son was then stabbed and attacked. So you just had this waves of trauma just slamming all cohesively together that I didn't even have the opportunity to process one before the next blow came. And then the next blow came. And then at the same time, life is still going on as that time is still ticking. I've got two 9-year-old twins. I've got a 10-year-old daughter. I've got a 17-year-old son, all trying to navigate their own griefs and their own pains of how they're feeling from Kyron's murder. And social services had sent my children, referred the younger ones to the Anna Freud Centre up in London for therapy. And it was a really difficult process for me. And I wasn't able to support them properly through it because of their age. I had to sit in. And where I hadn't really come to terms with things myself, every time the therapist asked them a question, my mind started to answer that question. So even when I had to make the excuses to leave, my children sort of had that sort of closure where you can kind of wrap things up and leave them at a safe space. But as I've come out of the room, I've got a new gashing, scar of where I've been ripped open. This is this area now. There's no surgical sort of process to neatly clean that and tidy that wound. So I was just left with all these open wounds were just getting infected, and they were just really starting to ooze and weep. And I didn't know how to say to someone, this is what's going on in my mind. This is what's going on inside me. I don't know what to do because I don't know how to process this, because all I kept getting from people is, right, okay, stop. Come on, you're a mum, you've got children. Come on, get up. You've got to do this. You've got kids. You can't not do that. You want to just say, I don't want to get in bed today, but you've got to get up. You've got kids. They still got to get to school. They've still got to live. You've still got to carry on an element of normal in an abnormal chaos, and you've never been through this process before. You've never navigated through something like this before, but you're supposed to know all the answers, and you're supposed to know everything that should be done and show up on time, be available, look the part. Hair needs to be done, clothes need to be neat and tidy, makeup needs to be on, kids need to be at school, they need to be well. You have to go through this motion, and you are a corpse, completely dead. Every bit of your body is shattered and broken, and with the breaks you can feel it as if it's trying to bust, the bones are trying to rip out of your skin. There's like this weighing axe on my chest that is just tearing at me, and it's this constant pain. And in that, there's nobody that at this time can see you as an individual, because to the police you're Kyron's mum, to the children you are mum, to the family you're someone's mum. So you've got the title of mum, but then you kind of lose the title of
when do you get to be Rachel?
Yeah, and it's like Rachel doesn't actually exist anymore, because you are now the mum. You're the mum of the dead child, you're mum of the 4 living children. You're the mum, you're the caregiver, you're the strength, you're the one. The children's healing, as far as the world made me believe, was tied up in me, because if the children saw that I was okay, it would help them to be okay. So in a way, everything that I'd done was kind of giving the children permission to do. So you have got no alternative but to throw on a mask and just turn up. And that, I think, really solidified where that emotional numbness came in, because I think I had to shut everything down and just do.
Would you say to a certain degree you were in maybe denial in some aspects?
You're in denial, you're in shock, you're in disbelief, you're in chaos or in madness. It's the most insane process, because everything's new. These are not emotions that you would have talked about before, or you would have experienced before, or you've navigated before. This is the first time having to deal with really large emotions. There's no language pattern to kind of explain what I'm feeling or what I'm going through. There isn't anything. What we can all say is, okay, Kyron's been stabbed, there's been an incident, and this is it. Like, you can talk the preliminary of what's gone on, but really trying to dissect, what does this really mean? What does it mean that this child has been murdered? What does that really mean to me as his mum? How am I going to be impacted? When people say, how are you? My natural talk was, I'm fine. I didn't know what more to say. How do I say it? I don't know how to explain it, so I didn't explain it.
So you had this mask that you...
all the time. So you'd get through the day, and at the end of the day, when everyone went to bed and the house became silent, roll up on the sofa and then just cry. I didn't sleep. I went through days where it could be 3, 4, I just couldn't sleep. I'd cry. My eyes got really sore. They started to cry. My eyes started oozing. I was really struggling, and people, they saw I was sad, but people wouldn't necessarily say, oh my gosh, you look haggard, because to a degree, I should be allowed to look sad. So people left it, but it was trying to, as you say, go on, because I think 2 weeks after Kyron died, my oldest son turned 18. It was his 18th birthday. And you've got to try and do things. So I remember being in Westfield and buying him clothes and then preparing to take him out for a meal and going out to a restaurant. And every time you're smiling, the guilt is ripping you inside with that voice is saying to you, how dare you smile? Your child is dead. Like, how dare you even laugh? And so you're trying to balance inner guilt with, I've still got a responsibility.
That sounds like one hell of a conflict.
It is awful. It is awful, because it is hard, because there isn't anybody in your shoes at that time. For me, there wasn't anybody to say, okay, this is exactly what I'm feeling. And I could just say something and they say, do you know what? I understand. When we were little, we grew up in church, and my mum used to say that language, that tears were a language, because some people would pray and just cry. People say that God just understood, he understood those tears, because that was a language within itself. I wish in reality that was it. That I could just sit and mumble whatever came out of my mouth. That language and that emotion was understood by somebody who had gone through, and they would be able to say something to give me words. Because you think, how long does this bit of the pain last? How long? And some things can't be answered. Some things can't be answered. But I needed some at that time who could understand. Nobody couldn't. My family was all I could lean on, but it was hard for them because they were also grieving the version of Kyron that they knew. So they wasn't able to. So even when we were at my mum's, if we broke down, I remember my eldest son went to my mum's and he broke down. My mum called my sisters to come and get him. And it wasn't because she didn't want to comfort him in his time of need. She didn't know how to comfort him and maintain her own emotions. And that was the problem. You've got everybody is compartmentalized because they're processing the loss or the memories of their version of Kyron, you know? So even my son, he's mourning a brother. My children are mourning a brother. I'm mourning a son. My sisters are mourning their nephew, but it was still my son.
So where does that leave space for you, once again, as Rachel, to have that space to grieve or to reach out?
I didn't. I think that's why I ended up writing, because I didn't. I couldn't make sense of things. There wasn't really anybody to... And I found, as I was saying to you before we started the podcast, there was a long part of my life where within that kind of drama triangle, I always took on the role as the rescuer. I always wanted to fix things for other people. And in doing so, I impacted their ability of taking ownership and accountability to the part that they played in situations, because I would always just fix it for them. And in this situation, I noticed that I couldn't take off that jacket. I still went into it as the rescuer. So when people started to cry, I was comforting them and telling them it's okay, you know. And in my head, I'm thinking, no, it isn't okay. Your son is dead, you know. And I found that that's what needed to happen. So you automatically kind of fall into this role. So even with my family, there were parts where I had to step back and say, to a degree, because I've always been the one to kind of fix everything, I hid the part of Rachel that needs. And so even when the worst possible thing happened, I think people still just saw she's the strong one. She always knows what to do. She always knows what to say. She always knows she's going to get past. I had people say to me, if anyone would get past something like this and do something great, if it's going to be you, I know it's going to be you.
However well-intentioned, I'm sure that wasn't particularly helpful for you to hear that.
Because all I want to do is lay on the floor and cry. And so when I started hearing those voices, because at the beginning I couldn't differentiate, is this grieving mourning or am I now going mad? So when the voices started, I was too embarrassed to speak because I thought I've lost a child and I cannot bear to experience anything like this again. So if I now tell people these things is going on in my head, is it going to be a thing of someone's going to bring me to social services, social is going to take away the remainder children? I can't have some. So I didn't speak. I would be in the kitchen, I started peeling potatoes, and the voice would say to me, cut your wrists. I'd open a window, it would tell me to jump out the window. I'd be walking over a bridge and I'd start shaking because it would be telling me to throw myself over the bridge. So I started having this internal warfare and I was struggling to rationalize why I shouldn't listen. And then my eldest son was attacked. It was a case of mistaken identity in Crystal Palace. And he was stabbed.
That's also in the book. You talk about that.
He was stabbed 3 times. And that was a catalyst because now, I can't keep my children safe and my children clearly are going to be better off without me because with me being their mum, they're just all dying and there's nothing I can do about it. So now I've got to a point where I've not sought any help. This has been going on and on. It's now entrenching because you've got months of this internal anguish and this fake persona, this fake pretense on the outside.
Yeah.
So you now can't see there's a need here, but now I'm struggling. And on the times when I couldn't contain those emotions, so when we were going to choose his casket, for example, I cried, but to everybody else around me, it was validated.
Yeah.
It was a casket.
Yeah.
When I was at the funeral and was at the grave and they were throwing the dirt, I was allowed to cry because it was validated because people saw it as an appropriate time. You know, those small little deposits you had, but other than that, that was it. I was just trapped. And I think going through this whole ordeal, I do voluntary work as part of the prison ministries and I go around the prisons as part of, it's called the Sycamore Tree program.
Yeah.
And you go in as a victim impact week on week 3 and you tell your story. And a lot of my healing has come from speaking to a group of 20 strangers and telling them the story of Kyron. And the reason why I found that healing process so powerful is because these individuals have now given me permission to just talk about my child and talk about how this process has impacted me and what I feel. And if I break down crying, they leave me to cry. They let me cry. I'm not given a timeline of when I have to start. All I get offered is a handkerchief or a bit of tissue. But people let me cry, they let me talk, they let me share, and they let me say, and I've never had an environment within my immediate circle where I could do you understand what I mean? So the writing, the prison ministries, even just poetry, those were only areas really that I had as outlets to really express. And then I did my therapy. And when I did the trauma therapy, thankfully, my therapist's brother had been murdered through knife crime. So I had somebody now I could actually really now just speak with. And she understood it from a sibling point of view because she was the sister of this person that had been murdered. But then understood certain things that I was saying from the mum's point of view, then was able, when she gave that feedback, could tell me how certain attributes that I was doing, how that may now impact my children or how my children might be viewing this. And she said to me, give your children that same permission to heal. Talk about Kyron. Talk about him in the house as though he's there. Because they will want to talk about him. But if you don't talk about him, they're not going to want to upset you, so they won't bring him up. Talk about him. And I remember...
You also mentioned, sorry to cut you right there, but just so for anyone listening that may have children that are dealing with complicated grief, you spoke about it really beautifully in the book where, your younger children would ask questions as opposed to what happened. And you've been advised by a therapist to give them really direct.
The therapist, so basically what she said is to talk about him. But she said you don't give them more than what they can process. So let them lead it. So when the children ask you a question, answer the specific question that they've asked you because they're ready for that information. That's why they've asked. And then let them absorb and process that and deal with anything that might come up from that. Only give them as much as they ask, not too much. And that really did work because then once we started to talk about him, I noticed that the children would freely mention his name. In the beginning, it was difficult because I noticed they'd look at me. So if I looked happy, they didn't want to mention his name because then they didn't want that sadness to come on my face. But then after a while, they realized that, no, we can talk about it. We can laugh about Kyron. We can cry about Kyron. We could do whatever, but, Kyron is your brother. He's part of this family. He can be alive. Pictures of Kyron were then, it wasn't just because what we did is at the funeral, there was lots of different pictures of Kyron on tables. That was the only pictures in the whole house. And then I thought, the other children need to also feel that they're part of this process. So I changed it. So you'd have the pictures of Kyron, but be pictures of all of the children again. And Kyron. It's sad. Pictures are very sad because it's a never aging photo. You've got one picture and you're never ever going to get a photograph of him. Any other age is going to stop here. So sooner or later, when you think about it, my eldest daughter is 16. She's now older than her older brother. So you're going to see images of a 16-year-old next to a 15-year-old brother. One day, God willing, she's going to be 33 next to her 15-year-old brother.
And you spoke about
never going to end.
You did speak about that in the book. I think someone gave you that as a gift.
Yeah, and it's hard. It's not easy. It's not easy, but the process is never going to be easy. And I think sometimes you have to, there's a saying where it says, change the things that you can and accept the things that you can't change. You need to accept that this isn't going to change. And then how are we going to now move on from? And I had PTSD prior to Kyron's murder and I didn't know.
So that can also impact the complicated grief aspect about it.
Which I didn't know. And that diagnosis came when we started bereavement therapy because they delve a lot into the past. And it was following that, this, as you say, I suppose they call it now, it's complex post-traumatic stress disorder, isn't it? And the anxiety and the depression that came with. But that wasn't new to Kyron. So there was an aspect of me where there was an emotional detachment anyway. And
maybe even some dissociation.
Yeah. And I often did disassociate myself from certain situations. So the level of emotional investment that I should have in particular situations or people, it wasn't really there. And so a relationship ended today, I'd get up tomorrow and be okay. And it wasn't because I didn't care about the individual, but there was I have detachment issues, you might as well say it as that. And that stems from childhood trauma.
You call it detachment issues, I call it attachment issues.
Yeah. It's the same thing, attachment. I've got attachment issues, When you give birth to your own child, and it's even with those issues before with other people, the relationship you have with your own child is still different. It's still very, very different. And I think even now, I don't think it's something to say you can ever get over. People say you learn to live alongside it. For me, I don't think I'm living. What's happening at the moment, I am existing in the world with all of this grief But what I'm learning to do is I'm learning, and the moment I'm able to enjoy small deposits of things and I'm not faking it anymore.
For the listeners for the podcast, that might be interesting because you explained how difficult it was for you in the beginning. How did you get to this point? How did you function? And how have you now got to a place where you, like, what did you do to get to this place where you now feel like you can exist, have these deposits?
I think one, it is time. And I wrote a poem once from my blog, and it said you need to give time enough time to work. So it's not a time where people give you their own made up time frames of, right, the funeral's over, 2 weeks later, right, you've got to get on now, get over it, move on. No, it's not that. You've got to allow yourself time. And that time is an inner pace that is uniquely significant to just you. It's the time you need to process. You have to find ways. So for me, writing, I did a blog. I was on a radio talk show with a friend of mine, and we were able to talk about real life situations and things, and even did a topic on knife crime and loss and different things like that.
And that gave you a purpose.
Yeah, 100%. Because it's something meaningful. And so it gives you the opportunity to take, it's one of those one where somebody interrupted my life story with a ruthless act and sent my world into chaos. And now I need to take back control over that situation. So you're not going to be the author and finisher of my life. I'm going to do that last chapter. But what I need to do is I need to take this situation and make this situation work for a greater good. And the reason how by doing that is, one was with the book, but again, it was the prison ministries. Once I started doing the Sycamore Tree program, was my opportunity to take back control over this situation. So, and that was empowering, so empowering.
And just tell people a little bit more about the Sycamore Tree Project for those that don't know. I know it's based around the story in the Bible of Zachariah.
Yeah, so it's based around the story of Zach, who was a tax collector. And what he used to do is he deceitfully used to take taxes and take far more than what the people need to pay. And one day he listens to, I think, Jesus telling a story, and Jesus goes and dines with him. I think he repents, kind of long story. And he ends up going and giving back what he had taken, but twofold more. He gave back to everybody more than what he did. So the purpose of the Sycamore Tree, it's not a religious thing, but the purpose of it is based around that story, and it's to work against reoffending. But what it does is it gets the individual to look at what's happening, but take ownership and accountability for the part that they played, but also understand the ripple effects of crime. So knowing that, yes, your victim was an individual in a face, but you had so many faceless victims that are now impacted by your one crime. And the whole purpose of bringing in the victim, let's say, so somebody like myself who has been impacted by crime, to tell that story is it gets them to understand that ripple effect. And then it's like you're turning it around for them to see it, for them to get to a point where they feel repentant in themselves, but, really, truly sorry for what it is.
And it encourages them to look at even circumstances within their own lives. So the effects, like you said, the ripple effects, the effect that it has, that their offending behaviour has on their family, the people that love them as well.
And it's letting go of the anger.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've realised that really impacts the healing process is when you stay angry, because we kind of make it, don't we, where we think, okay, this person has killed Kyron. I have to be angry with this person because it was not okay what you did. And so people really struggled when I said, will I forgive him? Because for me, forgiveness is not about justifying the individual and saying, listen, Michael, you were justified by killing my son. That's not what it's about. Me forgiving you is saying, you know what, you've killed my son, but I'm not going to allow you to kill me. So I'm going to forgive you so I can set me free from you so that I can do it's setting yourself free. And it's giving you that peace because I am going to keep living. But one thing, whether you be a perpetrator or a victim, there's also a part where you have to forgive yourself. Because every human being, no matter what they've done, is going to get to a point where there's going to be that part where you feel that guilt. And he will hold his own guilt for what he's done. I'm going to hold guilt because the doctor asked me if it was all right to switch off the life support machine. Well, I held guilt for 1.5 years because I couldn't differentiate between myself and Michael because I was my son's murderer because I let them switch that life support machine off. And that punished me for 1.5 years. He's got his own things that he has to hold up because for the rest of his life, he's going to be on a life license. He'll have to be going to probation, but he will always have that title of murderer. You will always be Kyron's murderer, and I'm always going to be Kyron's mum. My title was never going to hold the same stains that his title holds. But that's something he will have to come to terms with. But the ripple effects for him, they don't end when he comes out of prison. Because when he has children, the internet is a vast place, isn't it? He's going to have children. One day, his children might go online and Google something. His face is going to come up and they're going to know what you've done. And that goes on and on and on. And who knows the impact that would have on the child? You know, children bully each other, the teasing. You don't know what's going to happen or how that then unfolds for him. But I couldn't allow myself to be chained to him and chained to that trauma, because I would have just died, you know, and it would have been that anchor to just sink me in. And I would have fallen so deep into a depth of despair. I don't think I'd have been able to myself.
Anger is a very powerful one. It's one of the stages of grief.
But then you have, for the perpetrator on their side, they kind of feel that, well, you know what, if it wasn't for you, we'll be in prison. So they've got anger too. They're angry at the victim. But sometimes you're not angry for yourself. And I remember I had to accept that, you know what, when you stop being angry, that's when you give yourself permission to heal and permission to change.
So that's a good point for me to ask you then, because it's been put to me by some of my friends that are fellow therapists that they think, to a certain degree, moving out of complex grief or really intense grief there's a certain amount of choice involved. What do you say to that?
I think I understand exactly what they mean. I think it's in any given situation, as you say, loss comes in many different forms. When you are in a relationship ends. Back in the day, I remember my friends would be in bed crying for 3 weeks. They'd be moping about. They'd be calling up the partner's phone and quickly hanging it up. They'd be following them to see what they're doing on Facebook or where they're going, or checking their WhatsApp, seeing the profiles. And you really kept yourself so caught in that. And then one day they decide, I've got no time for this, I'm going to move on. They get up, put themselves together, and then they go out. Whether they start going out to clubs or they join a dating app, but they put themselves back out there. And once they do that, they get over the thing that they were chained to a couple of months before. So there's something you can't change, but there is a part where you've got to make a decision.
So how do you know when it's the right time? If it kind of is this choice, how do you know when it's the right time to really start moving on?
As I say, the way time works for each and every individual is very different. It's very unique to the person. I think there are some things, so as you say, this death has happened, this trauma has happened. I've got children. Whether I wanted to or not, I had to get up every day. I had to drop children to school. I had to clean my house. I had to cook dinner. I had to do laundry. I had to do chores. So those 5 elements, there was nothing I could do. I had to do that. And then ultimately, I've got bills to pay. I had to go back to work. So you've now got things that make you move. And in those few little elements, you start doing things. You start interjecting certain aspects of life. So as you say, there's now purpose.
Did you find that maybe making plans for the future, did that help you?
I didn't make plans.
You didn't make
plans? If I'll be honest, I didn't make plans. What I did is I got myself into a routine, the mundane routine.
Yes,
of taking them to school.
That's very important, guys, for the purpose of the podcast. That's one of the things that they suggest to deal with either simple grief or complex grief. Like keeping a steady routine can be helpful, because it can make you, for example, not neglect the physical needs like the eating and the sleeping and things.
That's something you can't help. So even to now, you can see how sunken in my eyes. I can't sleep. So that's something it's never come back. So it's like, for myself, when it happened, it's like I was reborn after Kyron died. I'd forgot how to do everything. I forgot how to laugh. I didn't forget how to cry. That's all I did. But I forgot how to laugh. I forgot how to feel. I didn't know how to just do the very basic things that I once used to do, like sleeping. And the motivation to want to exercise or to want to look good or, to want to go out. And so all of that is completely gone. So you don't really have that aspect in things. So it was more, the mundane routine was get up, drop the kids to school, do their laundry, do their hairs, cook dinner, clean my house. That was it. Then it was go to work, and it was like, leave Rachel at the door. You're now a registered manager. What tasks need to be done on this day?
So you're putting on a different
and there was different hats for different things. So at home, I was mum, and I did the mundane routines for mum. When I went to work, I was a registered manager, and I did the mundane routines for work. And then in between, so when I would go to work, I'd walk. So I walked from Crystal Palace to Streatham. So as I'm walking, that's my opportunity. I might have a little cry. I might have a little process. I might think about things. I might question things. There might be something. Thankfully, I had 3 really good friends, Kitty, Rebecca and Rachel. And through that, they were all of the court hearings. They came to all the meetings with the police. So if something was just confusing in my head, had them that I could
Yeah.
kind of talk about it with, because they were going through that with me. So I did all that in that little walk, because that's my opportunity to be Rachel, because it was just me. I didn't need to be anything else. I could just be me. And then you get work, you get home, and it was just. And I think as time went, it started. But I do agree when they say you've got to give yourself the permission sometimes, because I've been invited to loads of places. People would invite me around to their houses, or invite me out, or invite me to parties, or invite me to the kid parties. Go. Sometimes I send my children. And then one day I thought, right, you've got to make it. And then I found when I did do some things, there's little things I actually enjoyed, and I actually had the opportunity to have a good time. I think, I could do that again. But it took me a long time to accept it was okay to laugh. And in laughing, it wasn't sort of forgetting Kyron died, and that it was okay to let go of the grief and pick back up that joy, because I wasn't letting go of Kyron. And I actually wrote a blog about it. It was a year and a half later. And it was at the point when I realised that there was no comfort in the why. There's no point keep asking the why, because there was never ever going to be a justification given to me that was good enough.
Yeah,
that's the way it's not here.
No, good enough.
So then I had a conversation with a gentleman, and I ended up writing a blog, and it was my debt to grief had been paid. I realised that I was giving grief far much more of a wage than what it deserved. The debt was paid. You've taken Kyron, you've taken my son. The debt was paid. So it was time to say, I'm going to let you go, and I'm going to go back, and I'm going to pick up that joy, and I'm going to start doing some of the things that I once did enjoy, and allow myself to experience some forms of joy. Because when I thought back on it, Kyron would never have wanted me to have been lost in sorrow.
Definitely.
And one of the things that he always caused whenever he was around was the biggest smile. And if I cried, Kyron used to cry, he hated me being sad. And I had to realise that if he had a choice, he would say, give my mum back her joy.
Yeah.
And it is, you do. It's permissions that you're giving yourself, but it's trying to make sure you give yourself that permission. But guilt is always going to be that voice that's going to make you feel that you're doing something wrong, but you're not doing something.
So Rachel, what can other people do to help? Because you spoke about it in your book. Sometimes you felt like you mentioned 3 members of your support system, and they mentioned throughout the book, but you have quite a large extended family, a lot of friends, like you're a very popular person, but a lot of people were not there for you, like in your greatest time of need. So what can people, if they know someone that's suffering from complicated grief, like what kind of things can they do to help? Because I think sometimes people don't really know what to say.
And I think that is the key. I don't think that people are deliberately not there because they don't care. I think it gets to a point where people will see you at your darkest moment, and they will see you suffering. Even when you do that fake smile, they will see the deadness behind your eyes, and they see that darkness. They will see the sorrow, and they see the pain. And when we can't take the ugliness away, we feel disabled, like, well, I don't know what else to do, because I can't fix what's gone wrong. I can't take it away. And they don't know what to do. But sometimes just being there can be so powerful. Just letting that person speak, using a language they know how to use, let them say and vent in the way that they need to vent, and be honest. Say, I do not understand what you're going through. I don't know what it is that you need, but if your tears need to die on my shoulder, then I will sit here with you for 5 hours and let them die on my shoulder. I can't take that pain away from you, but if I can hug you to embrace you and comfort you but for a moment, then I'm going to comfort you for that moment, The children, it might be a lot. I will come, because you might not want to take the children away because you're not sure will I be all right on my own. But if you phone me and I don't really want to talk, end the call back again tomorrow.
Yeah.
Because I might want to talk, I might not want you to come to my house because I might not be able to process, but just dropping a little card through the door, just letting me know that you're thinking about me, or a text.
Yeah.
In today's society, when we've got this social media, a text message,
yeah,
or WhatsApp message.
There's so many ways that you can
just something to let the person know you're not alone. If you ever need to talk, I'm here. Don't promise people, say if you need anything, because what they need, you're not going to be able to provide, or they might. So say, if you need anything, if I can do it, I will give it back on. Let's see what else I might be able to do to help. There's so many things that you can do to make somebody feel that they're not alone.
How powerful is just the simple act of listening? Because I know to most people, listening involves some kind of transaction where someone tells you something and you kind of respond. But as someone who's a therapist, and I look at listening from a different perspective, like listening doesn't necessarily require a response. And I think sometimes what makes it hard for people to listen is their own feelings towards something. How important is it that people just give you that space?
And I think that in it's the most powerful part. You've got to just listen. and listen to understand, don't listen to respond, because your response could be what causes the offense because you come from a place of ignorance, and just listen. If you've not walked that walk, I don't know. Even now, I can speak to so many parents who've lost a child, but what they're feeling, even though I might understand, it's still going to be different to what I'm feeling, because they didn't know Kyron and I don't know their child.
And
I don't know the relationship that they have.
Unique.
Exactly. Because one thing that we can all agree is we've got all this love for our children with nowhere for it now to go. And the weight of that love is tremendous. So I can understand that.
So some things are universal, even if you don't understand the direct context.
Exactly.
Some things are universal. Pain is very universal.
You can understand the pain of going to a graveside to sing happy birthday to a bit of mud and grass, compared to going to a hall and having a tangible human being that you can sing happy birthday. Yes, little things. You know, when someone comes to complain about their children, oh, how I wish I could even have that to moan about with Kyron. Like, you think, I don't even take that for granted anymore. Used to, if you could message me back in the day before Kyron died, and I'd be, oh God, this one did, and now, you know, they are good. They are happy. They're blessed. They're doing GCSEs. Living, because the things that were once so big, it doesn't even mean anything to me anymore. But I just think, you know, you're complaining now, but I can guarantee you, if the child was gone, that's going to be the very same thing you miss about them. You know,
and maybe the exact thing you feel guilty about feeling.
But you'd miss them. So that's different, you know. When people talk to me from a different place, I will now speak, because you just think, what support can you get? You know, someone's told you, oh, this child is causing trouble. Okay, well, what support is out there? Have you tried to do this? Have you tried to do that? Have you sought to do? Because it's more about relationship building with parents, seeking support and help externally, because sometimes we can't do it all ourselves, you know. And one thing with grief, you realise that, as your therapist friend said, there's permissions that you've got to give yourself to heal. You do have to give yourself permission to heal, and you do have to give yourself permission to change. I agree with 100%. People hold on to grief and pain so tight because they think that that symbolises holding on to that loss or the person that they've lost. It doesn't. It doesn't. By giving yourself permission to heal doesn't mean you love that person any less, or doesn't mean you love the thing or anything any less. You're not justifying what's happening. You're not even saying, I accept what's happening. You don't have to ever accept it. But what you have to do is you have to learn to live. And that's a whole completely different category.
So that's the, like, trying to come to terms is the new norm.
And you've got
never
to
accept.
No. And you've got to accept that who you were then will not be who you are now. So you punish yourself more by trying to seek out the characteristics excitement of who you used to be. I used to be the life and soul of every party. I was the loud one. I was jumping up and down. I'd be carrying on. I wanted to. Now I'm the quietest one. I will sit in the corner. I will sit on my little drink, and I will hum along to my songs, and I'm very happy and content. It's a complete contrast to who I used to be. But in this new version of me, that's a new normal, and that's a new normal. I can find quite a lot of happiness.
Very true. That's just how. What the only one last thing I'd ask you: what would you say to anyone that's going through complicated grief right now? What are some of the things that help? So you've mentioned support systems, being listening, keeping the routine, looking after your physical health, things like that. You've mentioned your experience of therapy, taking each day at a time, and obviously you wrote. Is there anything else you can think of, because you're the expert here?
I think just remember that it is okay to not be okay. And if there's a day comes that you need a day to cry, then just cry. But make sure you've got something planned to get back up. So what I used to do, and it was something my therapist told me, because I never had those opportunities for Rachel. When it was quiet, it was just me in her home. She said, I used to have a candle. And she said, burn the candle for, say, half an hour. And just think about Kyron. Let those emotions come, let those feelings come, let those thoughts come. But make sure I had something planned after that half an hour. And it would be, for example, somebody's going to be coming to my house in half an hour. So when I've got a breakdown, I'm not crying to the walls or shouting into pillows. Somebody's going to come, and I'm going to have that physical support. So it's important to have support internally in your internal circles as well as externally. Don't feel embarrassed or ashamed to say, this is what I'm going through and I need this additional support. Doctors will help. In my case, support help. Usually my family liaison officer help.
And there's loads of like peer support.
Yeah, there are lots of peer support groups now. Victim support off a peer support group. You do have different organisations which are out there, and it's important to go and seek them out.
Yeah, Cruise is a good one for bereavement guys.
Yeah, it is, and it's getting them, and it's small things like just being honest. I think we spend so much time as human beings feeling embarrassed or feeling that we've got to put forward a particular persona. People think that we're living our best life and we're wearing all these, especially this whole new social media craze where everyone's out there And it looks, doesn't it, that everybody's living this great life and life is going on so fantastic that you will start to think, is it just me? Am I the only one that's having? It's not. They're all going through the same things that they're going through. They've just taken a picture of a moment. They've taken a picture in a nice outfit for a moment.
Yeah.
They've taken a picture of all, and the picture that they posted today was probably taken 3 years ago.
It's just
because they are feeling
image,
in that place where you're at that moment. And they just use that past memory as a booster to remind them of good things, you know, and it's remembering those things and allowing themselves to appreciate those memories, but knowing that you're allowed to laugh, you're allowed to have fun, you're allowed to cry, you're allowed to feel, you should be feeling whatever emotions that you need to be feeling, but just give yourself the opportunity to heal at a pace that's comfortable for you. It's not a race, it's not a rush, it's not determined by anybody else. You know, you're not there to make somebody else feel good themselves. You're there to heal and get back to the best place you could be so that you're living your best life and you're able to live, which is the operative word, because existing is so unhealthy, it's so unhappy, it's so lonely. You know, you deserve to live. You don't need to ask people permission to live, because people are never going to ask you permission to cause you the pain that you would have felt or to cause you the trauma that you would have felt. You just need to find ways to kind of overcome and find things that work for you. And writing is amazing. Get a diary. Doesn't need to be seen by no one. Just write down your thoughts as raw as they come, as crazy as it might sound, as outlandish is. Do it, lock it away. No one needs to see it. Do it for yourself. And when you're ready, burn it or keep it as a memory to remember where you came from.
Or like Rachel did,
or publish it.
Make it into a remarkable book. So Rachel, just remind everyone again the title of the book.
It's called Kyron, Hello Madness, Goodbye Joy, and it's available on Amazon.
And guys, I would seriously recommend it. It's a brilliant read. And as you can hear, Rachel is just an amazing character. Like, she's just captivated me completely on this podcast, and I'm so grateful that she's come on and shared her experiences with you. So I'm going to clap, and you know, I'm sure the listeners will say thank you, because it's been so helpful. And for me as a therapist, to hear your experiences, for me, you're the expert, and I can learn so much from just what you shared with me. So thank you so much.